फिर आप देखेंगे लेफ़्ट साइड के लोअर कॉर्नर में आपको सेटिंग का ऑप्शन मिल जाएगा, उस पर आपको क्लिक करना है। तो सेटिंग के ऑप्शन पर क्लिक कर लेते हैं। सेटिंग के ऑप्शन पर क्लिक करने के बाद आपके सामने कुछ ऐसा इंटरफेस आ जाएगा। फिर आपको यहाँ कई सारे ऑप्शन मिलेंगे। पहला ऑप्शन होगा जनरल का, दूसरा होगा चैनल का, तीसरा होगा अपलोड डिफ़ॉल्ट, चौथा होगा परमिशन और पांचवा कम्युनिटी का होगा। तो आपको चैनल के ऑप्शन पर क्लिक करना है। तो आप जैसे ही चैनल के ऑप्शन पर क्लिक करेंगे तो आपके सामने 4 ऑप्शन और आ जाएंगे, बेसिक इन्फो, एडवांस सेटिंग, ब्रांडिंग और फीचर एलिजिबिलिटी। ठीक है, तो आपको जाना है एडवांस सेटिंग के ऑप्शन पर। तो एडवांस सेटिंग के ऑप्शन पर क्लिक कर लेते हैं। ऑप्शन पर तो यूट्यूब स्टूडियो के ऑप्शन पर क्लिक कर लेते हैं।
Your donations power the journalism that so many people rely on from NPR and public radio stations across the country. Your donations power the journalism that so many people rely on from NPR and public radio stations across the country. In this overwhelming, unprecedented moment, you can make a difference. Give to your local NPR station. Get started at donate.npr.org.
Hey, y'all, this is Sam on the line with Sam's Aunt Betty. Hi, Aunt Betty.
Hey, Sam, how are you?
How are you?
I'm really well, thanks.
Well, I want to talk to you today because we are doing a very special episode all about how coronavirus is changing the entertainment industry and Hollywood. And I said to myself all week putting this show together, Betty loves movies.
Yes, she does.
And I was thinking this past Christmas, what I enjoyed perhaps the most that day, was it on Christmas Day exactly where you and I went to the theater to see Knives Out?
Yes, it was. It was. I think it was before or after our Chinese thing, and then we went to the movies. Yeah.
Yeah, Chinese buffet and a movie. It was a wonderful Christmas.
Doesn't get much better, does it?
Yeah. You know, one of the questions we're asking this episode is, when will the current crop of TV shows and movies and content dry up? I mean, as someone who is at home like the rest of us, do you worry about that day?
Never. It has not crossed my mind.
I think about it all the time.
I mean, I'm having a ball with stuff that was on when I was a child.
Like what?
Like Danny Thomas Show, Make Room for Daddy. I love those old shows. Alf. So, I mean, I was an adult when Alf came out, but
I had no idea you were an Alf fan.
I love Alf.
We're going to have to talk about that later. Well, I tell you what, I look forward to one day you and I going back to the movies again. We will find a dollar cinema that's still playing Black Panther, and we'll just go see it.
That's a date.
Okay. All right. Do the thing you do where you start the show.
All right, let's start the show.
Wakanda forever.
Hey, y'all, from NPR, I'm Sam Sanders. It's been a minute. This episode, we're going to talk about TV and movies and all the stuff we watch. And we're going to talk about how coronavirus is affecting all the people and businesses that make that stuff. If you're like me, one of the constants since this pandemic started has been sitting down on my couch in front of my TV. I can still watch just about everything I want anytime, even if I can't go to a bar or a concert or see family and friends. Most of the stuff we watch right now, it still seems steady and reliable. But coronavirus could change that. All those shows we're binging to pass the time, all those movies, they don't just appear magically in our Netflix queues. Someone's got to make them. So throughout this episode, we'll hear about what's changed for the people and businesses that make the things we watch. A camera operator in Atlanta tells us whether you can ever make a movie or TV set safely socially distanced. TV reporter Meredith Blake tells us how Netflix, right now at least, is one of the biggest winners in this whole mess. And author Shea Serrano talks about what we lose when we can't go to movie theaters, even if we can still watch new movies at home. But to start, let's hear from Jenny Yang. She's a TV writer and comedian based in Los Angeles, and she can recall exactly when coronavirus kind of put her life in the entertainment industry on hold.
Listen, I think when you're in entertainment or in a creative profession, you kind of accept a certain level of, chaos. But, I mean, this is next level chaos. It's game-changing chaos, And so I think for me...
Jenny just finished her second year writing for a sitcom, which is a big deal for her. She's kind of made it in Hollywood. But that's her day job. What Jenny is really passionate about is stand-up comedy. Before coronavirus hit, she'd lined up some gigs. One of them was scheduled for March 11th. You remember that day.
Somehow the NBA decided they were going to cancel, and that's when I felt like was the canary in the coal mine.
Jenny performed anyway, but after the show, she had to decompress.
I drank tequila on the rocks with 2 limes multiple times, and, I like that heavy liquor flavor, is what I'm saying. And that night, I even smoked my friend's cigarette. I don't smoke, Sam. I was just feeling... I was risking it all. I took a drag on a stranger's vape. This is what was happening that night.
She went home to reckon with her other big project, the one she'd been planning for years. This competitive self-care comedy show called Everything's Fine with Jenny Yang. Tickets were sold, sets and costumes were bought, celebrity guest stars were booked. But the next morning, she had to cancel everything.
And I was devastated. All day, I was crying. I was individually hitting all the buttons necessary to refund everyone's Eventbrite ticket.
Oh my
and
goodness.
It was like an act in torture for me to undo this beautiful vision and dream that I had worked many, many months emotionally preparing for, and then many years in a way preparing for, because 3 years before this, I bought the everythingsfine.com URL being like, I'm going to make this into something, and finally that moment happened.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. So then now you have that really emotional few days of having to just click the buttons, write the tweets, and adjust to this new life.
Yes.
Now, a few weeks into this, what is your normal day?
Well, my normal day is not much different from what I was anticipating, which is to have control over my time and to work on my writing, to work on producing shows at this point. Now I think we've all quickly pivoted to being online performers. I was just joking that we're all cam girls now. You know what I mean? This is OnlyFans. You know what I mean?
Check out
we're
my OnlyFans. Yes.
what I'm doing right now is doing what I've been doing, but I don't get to go out and see people to perform stand-up comedy. Stand-up comedy is inherently defined by standing up in front of people.
In front of people.
That's literally,
Yeah.
you're not
Yeah.
doing stand-up comedy if you're not standing up performing in front of people. Like, you can't, it's like, you can paint. You don't have to show people your paintings, and you're still painting, but this is not the same.
Yeah.
It's not the same.
Yeah. So have you been trying stuff on Instagram Live, doing comedy stuff? Like, are you broadcasting yourself on the social platforms from home?
Yeah. I think I would say within the first 3 weeks of everyone staying at home, my impulse was to just try to live stream literally every weeknight. And then eventually it felt like a little too much work, kind of encroaching on my evening sort of self-care energy.
Mm-hmm.
I'm now producing my Everything's Fine show to be a Zoom show, a Zoom meeting, and I'm going to try to do breakout rooms. I'm going to try to recreate as much as possible the live experience. So I'm going to tell people, get dressed up, make yourself a cocktail, show up 15 minutes before the show starts, and we're going to have people put you into randomly assigned breakout rooms where you can recreate the feeling of going up to the bar to order a drink and then accidentally saying hello to someone new.
Oh, I'm doing this next week. This sounds fun.
Oh my gosh, that would be awesome. Yeah.
So you, like just about everyone in the biz, is working really hard to figure out a new path forward.
Yeah.
I guess my biggest question is, even as creatives find these new paths and these new avenues, will y'all make money? Are you making money right now? Are you worried about money? Like, what's the financial on this?
Being a comedian and a writer, so when you're a writer-performer in entertainment, I feel like you have more options, right? Now, as a performer, a lot of those options have been limited because we don't have an audience that we could perform live to anymore, right? So prior to this, I used to run my own shows live. I used to tour colleges and universities. You might get a corporate gig here or there if you're a stand-up comedian, right? But, the reality is I cannot rely on that for the foreseeable future. Because I was on a TV show, fortunately, and thank you to the Writers Guild of America and the power of a writers union, I have savings from that. So I was already anticipating, prior to coronavirus hitting, living off of my savings if I needed to, and then on the writer's side, if you're in entertainment, that whole machine is still going because writers notoriously can be very solo and we can work from home. And I've been doing meetings with production companies and network folks and executives. You can do that, FaceTime, and I'm putting together pitches to sell for TV shows that hopefully someday we can make.
Thanks again to writer and comedian Jenny Yang for talking with us. You can find her on Twitter and on Instagram at Jenny Yang TV. One word. You're listening to It's Been a Minute from NPR. I'm Sam Sanders. This episode, how coronavirus is reshaping Hollywood. The thing about the entertainment industry, what we think of as Hollywood, is that it's not just in California anymore. One of the biggest places to film TV and movies right now is Atlanta. And pretty much all filming down there has shut down. That means all those behind-the-scenes folks, the set designers, the makeup artists, the sound engineers, they are out of work. Jessica Hershatter operates cameras on film and TV sets in Atlanta. You may have seen her work on a little show called Stranger Things.
So I'm a first AC, which means focus puller. I essentially control the focus of the camera. So changing lenses and batteries and building for new setups.
Jessica says she's anxious to get back to a production set very soon. Thing is, though, no one really knows yet what a safe set, a socially distanced set, should look like. Jessica recently read an article all about that in The Hollywood Reporter, and some of the options are really blowing her mind.
I was very interested to read all of their ideas, some of which are good ideas and some of which I think would be impossible.
Like what? Tell me one of the impossibles.
So it had mentioned, obviously, crew members wearing gloves and masks. They had talked about actors who are in intimate scenes, who obviously can't wear any protective gear because they're on camera, shooting their coverage at different times from each other, and then in post-production putting that together, which, we have the technology to do, but is kind of a crazy way of having to act they talked about, hand sanitizer and wash stations and temperature checks when you walk in. I think the things that would be challenging are, they had the idea of separating departments and limiting who is on set.
But don't y'all all work together?
Exactly. Everybody needs to be on set, and everybody needs to be near the actors or the camera or the equipment to do our jobs and light properly and set up the shots. And until we have an actual vaccine, which I hope happens, it's going to be really hard to prevent the spread of this, especially on a set.
Yeah. It seems like the real big question is either fewer people on a set or just bigger sets so everyone can space out 6 feet and stay apart. Which do you think seems most likely?
That was actually mentioned in the article too. They had said a couple of things. One, that shows probably won't all come back at once. It'll be kind of a trickle effect, and most likely the smaller shows will come back first. Because when you're talking about an Avengers movie, there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people working on that set. On the little MTV movie I was on, it was more like 50. And then the other big question like that was, is it safer to be on a soundstage as opposed to shooting in a location? Because locations are harder to control. Sound stages, you can do things like space people out or, build some walls to keep people separate from each other. So I think that might eliminate some of the lower budget shows that are not able to afford the builds on stage.
So as all of these negotiations are happening about what production looks like in a coronavirus reality, I'm wondering if people like you have enough say in those conversations. I assume that studio heads and directors and powerful actors can be in the room for these types of meetings, but I assume that below-the-line workers like yourself aren't there?
Honestly, that's the way it is for everything in the film industry. So I've kind of gotten used to the hierarchy of whose opinion matters. But I do have to say that in general, actors are more paranoid than the rest of us. So if anybody is concerned about health, it's the actors. So, I had a very strange incident on our very last day of shooting, which was I had a cold the week before, and I had a little remnant of a cough. I was very close to the actors, and I coughed twice, and I guess one of the actors was uncomfortable and told a producer, and I had 3 producers come up to me and tell me I wasn't allowed to cough.
I'm not going to ask you to name this actor, but if you want it.
But that was at the very beginning of all of this, and the witch hunt aspect scares me, because I imagine if we all come back and someone so much as coughs or sneezes, it's going to be a big deal.
So then, what I hear you saying is that, it's actually not about whether it's safe or not, it's about whether or not people feel safe.
Absolutely.
Thanks again to Jessica Hershatter in Atlanta. All right, time for a break. When we come back, how this pandemic is changing the ways we all watch TV, and the highs and lows of TV made via Zoom conference call. BRB.
This message comes from NPR sponsor BetterHelp, the online counseling service dedicated to connecting you with a licensed counselor to help you overcome whatever stands in the way of your happiness. Fill out a questionnaire and get matched with a professional tailored to your needs. And if you aren't satisfied with your counselor, you can request a new one at any time, free of charge. Visit BetterHelp.com/minute to get 10% off your first month. Get the help you deserve with BetterHelp. Support for NPR comes from Newman's Own Foundation, working to nourish the common good by donating all profits from Newman's Own food products to charitable organizations that seek to make the world a better place. More information is available at newmansownfoundation.org.
Hey, it's Guy Raz from NPR's How I Built This, and each week on the show during this unprecedented crisis, I'll be asking some of the top founders and builders how they're dealing with the economic impact of the coronavirus and hear about some of the ways they're pivoting to fight it. Subscribe or listen now to How I Built This.
We are back. You're listening to It's Been a Minute from NPR. I'm Sam Sanders. This episode, we are looking at how coronavirus has affected the entertainment industry. From writers and performers to behind-the-scenes workers to just how we're consuming media while we're stuck in our homes. To see how our viewing habits are changing, I called up an old friend of the show. Meredith, hey, how are you?
I'm okay. How about you?
I'm good. I'm making it. It's funny, I was thinking before this interview, the last time we talked, the world was completely different. We're talking about Friends, the NBC sitcom. And back then when we talked, that show was still on Netflix. That is no longer the case. And the entire world hadn't changed because of a little thing called coronavirus. Does it feel like forever ago?
It does. Those two world-changing events happened since we last talked. Friends left Netflix, and then a pandemic erupted.
That is Meredith Blake. She's an entertainment reporter for the LA Times. So, Meredith, you cover TV. My first question for you, how much have viewing habits changed? How different is TV watching right now?
It's definitely up. As of I think mid-March, streaming was up something like 36%. So it's undoubtedly it is up. The broadcast networks that in some ways are being hit the hardest by this, they've seen their numbers go up a lot because people are at home. So we're seeing ratings that we haven't seen on the regular in a while. There was that Disney sing-along the other night that got pretty big numbers. There was the Lady Gaga concert that got, I think, 20 million viewers or something, big numbers. So they're watching all kinds of TV.
There you go. If I'm looking at what coronavirus is doing to the entertainment industry as a business story, as an economic story, what has been the single biggest economics shift in this whole entertainment landscape since coronavirus happened? I mean, for me, what stands out the most is Netflix announcing recently that since the Rona hit, they have gained 16 million new subscribers.
Yeah, I mean, it's really accelerating. It's funny because the last time that we talked was about the streaming wars and the possible threat that these new services were going to pose to Netflix. And while services like Disney Plus have certainly seen the benefit, if we can call it that, of coronavirus, in some ways it's also just consolidated Netflix's kind of hold on the industry, and they're leading the charge. 15 million subscribers. It's the biggest quarter in the entire history of the company, and that's largely due to people being locked down at home and wanting stuff to watch, which I guess, that's the one kind of asterisk in all of this, which is that, is this sustainable? Because if you're not going to subscribe to Netflix now, when are you going to subscribe? So all the subscribers they're getting now, it's who's going to be signing up in November? Somebody who's just in a cave for 5 years? I don't know.
Yeah, this might be the peak.
Yes.
Yeah. We are both people who have to watch a lot of TV for work.